Well, good evening. Welcome to the Highlands. We're so glad that you're here. And it's going to be a great night together. Well, how many of you are morning people? Would you raise your hand? You're a morning person? All right, put your hands down. You all need Jesus. No, I'm just kidding. My wife and I, we got married and many years ago, and you know, when you get married, you're figuring out like, okay, her rhythms, my routines, and I'm not a morning person, but my wife is, she's amazing, all right? Don't spread anything out to her, but I'm trying to describe, she wakes up like ready for life. Like, how many of you wake up and you're like, are ready for the day? Like, you are a problem. No, I'm just kidding. Like, I'm teasing. I shouldn't say that. But my wife, and it was something unusual that I was like, oh my goodness. Like, so for me, I wake up and I need like a long runway to like face the day. Like, I need like, I don't drink coffee, but I drink tea. I need to go through that. I need to just sit. I need to process. I need to just slowly wake up. Unfortunately, I passed this down to both my girls who they like stare daggers at you if you wake them up too soon or you try to engage them. I'm like, oh, sorry, didn't mean to talk to you. I'm just your dad. But I'm reaping what I'm sowing. And so Amy, we are married, and now we're kind of working through, okay, here's rhythms and routines. And so one of the things I didn't understand was that she woke up just ready for everything. Like, she woke up and like the sky was like bluer than my sky. Like, I'm like, my sky is a rain cloud, but hers has rainbows. And I'm like, what is happening? Like, this is my life. Like, by the way, if you're dating or before you get married, these are questions to ask before you get married. And so I was like surprised by her rosy attitude in the morning. And so it was maybe our first or second Sunday after we had gotten married, after our honeymoon, that we were coming in to church. She was our children's pastor. I was the youth pastor. And so we're driving together. And you might think that, oh, wow, pastors married together, the wonderful conversations they have on the way to church. No, that's not the case, especially in the morning. So she's like chatting. I'm just like trying to wake up and face this Sunday that's coming. And I looked over and I said words that I just still regret almost 8 years later. I looked over to her. She's just chatting away, happy as a lark. She's looking at me with, again, rainbows in her eyes. And I'm looking at her, I'm like, well, you're just a chatterbox, aren't you? Oh my goodness. She actually reminded me of this just a few days ago, which is why I remember what I said. And she did not like that, and those rainbows were not pointing toward me anymore. Like, it was just all of a sudden thunder and lightning, and she was so offended, and for good reason. But I remember how even 8 years later, those words still, and I think she's able to joke about it now because she was with a friend recently, but 8 years later, those words still stick with her. And tonight I want to talk about, for just a moment, through the lens of money, how our words matter. And really not just our words, but how Jesus' words are so powerful. In fact, I heard about a Sunday school teacher who tried to describe the power of Jesus' words like this, where she said, let's assume that the distance between the earth and the sun, which is 92 million miles, she said, let's assume that distance is represented by the thickness of this sheet of paper. If that were so, and if this represented 92 million miles, then we would need a stack of paper that would be 70 feet high to demonstrate the distance between the earth and the nearest star. But we would need a stack of paper 310 miles high to represent the galaxy and the earth. That's how far and vast our galaxy is. But then she told these boys and girls, she said the galaxy is just a speck of dust in the universe. But Jesus holds that universe together by just the power of his words. You see, we're looking at Jesus' words. In fact, I have about 30-something verses for you, and I only have about 15 minutes left. So we're going to kind of run through this quickly. But I believe that everything we're looking at tonight is the words in red. It's all about what Jesus has to say regarding our money. I was youth pastor for 11 plus years, and one of my big regrets that I look back on that I didn't do was I didn't teach students about money. Now, my reasoning was teenagers don't have money, so why teach them about money? And you might be sitting here today, well, this message isn't going to apply to me because I don't have any money. But that's not the point. The point is not what's in your bank account. The point is what is in your heart. And so tonight we're looking at money. Has Jesus taught about it? And by the way, Jesus has a lot to say about biblical stewardship. So I want to jump into these 5 financial statements from Jesus and look at, okay, if he can hold the galaxies in orbit, what can he teach us about finances? And so let's jump into these first few thoughts as I share these 5 financial statements from Jesus. The first one we see is this: hold money loosely. Loosely. Matthew chapter 5 records Jesus is speaking. He says, give to the one who asks you, and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. I don't have time to go into this whole ordeal behind what Jesus is teaching, but basically he's referencing the law that in those days, if someone came to you, you would give them something in return. So if they came and they needed to loan, borrow, or whatever, you would say, okay, well, here you go. And that's why Jesus often says, if someone asks you to go with you 1 mile, then you go 2, because the idea was that you would go above and beyond what even was considered generous in those days. And so Jesus is reminding us to hold money loosely. Now, I'm not talking about cutting a hole in your pocket and just wasting and letting it fly out wherever you are. But what I am talking about is we hold on to this so tightly. We hold on to it so much where it consumes our every thought. It consumes every desire we have because we want just a little bit more. And so Jesus reminds us, and he says, hold that money loosely. In fact, he goes on to say in Matthew chapter 19, if you want to be perfect, he's telling this to a rich young ruler. He says, go sell your belongings and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me. So when the young man heard that, he went away grieving because he had many possessions. You see, this young rich ruler was not bad because he was rich or because he was young. He was erring because he was holding on to things too tightly. And Jesus is trying to encourage him and us, hold that money loosely. He goes on to say in Luke chapter 16, verse 9, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of worldly wealth, so that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. You see, we're to use our money to resource God's kingdom, not advance our own kingdom. Because here's the deal. Your kingdom and my kingdom, it's going to fade away when we pass off from this earth. But God's kingdom will stay forever and ever and ever. And so when we hold our money loosely and we say, okay, God's calling me to be generous. God's calling me to help a need, a neighbor, a single parent, somebody that has a need. I'm going to advance his kingdom through that generosity. I'm going to let that money go through my hands because I'm going to be just a steward or a vessel of my finances. So first of all, we see that we are to hold money loosely. But the second idea that Jesus gives us in Matthew chapter 6 and Mark chapter 12 is this: give money generously. Give money generously. He reminds us in Matthew chapter number 6, he says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. And by the way, that's a message in itself. How many of us sometimes that we do things if we're noticed? We do things for the photo op. We do things if a pastor's walking by. We do things if our boss is there. We do things if there's something in it for us. And Jesus is saying, hey, no, you need to practice your righteousness not to be seen by other people, not to be noticed, not to be put on their Instagram feed, but to know that you have no reward in your Father in heaven. And so he reminds us that we have to practice this idea of just being generous without anything in return. He goes on to say in verse number 2, so whenever you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do, to be applauded by people. We'll talk about that in a moment. Truly, I tell you, they have their reward. But then I love this, verse number 3, but when you give to the poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And here's what he's saying. In fact, he goes on to say, verse 4, we'll wrap this up, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. What Jesus is teaching us is saying, he says this, hey, you need to give in such a way that you forgot of what you gave. Now, here's the idea. I don't know if you've done this before, but have you ever given to something, and then you're like, I'm going to come back at you. Like, I'm going to give this to you now, but I'm going to come back later. Jesus is saying, you're not giving generously, you're giving conditionally. And so what he's reminding us is he's saying, hey, you give and then you forget and let God take care of the rest. But he goes on to say and gives us a scenario in Mark chapter number 12. In Mark chapter 12, verse 41, he says this, Jesus is sitting across from the temple treasury, and he watched how the crowd dropped money into the treasury. Many rich people were putting in large sums. Now, we have to stop here because this is a little bit unusual and not what we do today. Now, in those days, they had, in these temples, they had up to maybe 13 kind of trumpet-shaped baskets around their sanctuary, worship center, synagogue, however you want to call it. But they were all these giving stations around. And what happened was the people, particularly the rich people, this was their moment to shine. Like they came every Sabbath and like, oh yeah, I'm ready. I got my bag ready. I got all my coins ready. And here's what they would do. They would strut. Like they would just be like, yeah, I got this. Pastor, priest, oh yeah, you see, yeah, you hear it, you hear it, you hear it. I don't dance, but they probably danced like, did a little jig or something. They're like, yeah, here we go. They found their one basket that everyone was watching and they're like, whoa, I wonder how much so-and-so is gonna give. Last week, did you see the pouch they had? Did you see all the coins they gave? Oh wow, this is amazing. And what happened every Sabbath was it became this show of how much I was giving. Because again, they weren't generously giving, they were conditionally giving because they wanted the applause and recognition. It goes on to say in verse number 42, then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 tiny coins that were very little. I can imagine this widow, and I don't know if this is how it was, but maybe she's hunched over a little bit. She's older. She's not strutting. She's not dancing. She just is going to the bin. She's going to the collection. Maybe she's looking at the one far off on the corner that nobody sees. And then she puts her 2 coins in, and then she kind of walks back. By the way, a pouch with a lot of coins makes a lot of noise. 2 coins doesn't make very much noise. Here's the problem. Sometimes we give to make a lot of noise. But Jesus is saying, that is not the purpose of biblical stewardship. Not only should your right hand forget what your left hand forget. I'm going to get that right tonight. Not only should your left hand get what your right hand forgets what they give, but you need to forget and not think about who is going to see you give. Over the years, then there's been, not at this church, we are a very generous church and a very biblical church as far as how we give, and it's not conditional, but I've had pastor friends who have said, yeah, I've had people come and say, they pulled a check out, like almost like a ransom, like, I will give this to you, pastor, if. That's conditional giving. I'll give this to you if you say or do or don't say this. What they're doing is, they're like the Pharisees. Oh yeah, do you see what I'm giving? Do you hear it? Do you hear all the coins, pastor? And they hold it out. And Jesus reminds us, you need to give generously, not conditionally. And then he goes on to say in our third financial statement that he shares in Luke chapter 12 and even in Revelation 3, we'll mention in a moment, is this. This is very important. To trust God continually. Trust God continually. Now, I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really matter how many numbers, zeros that you have in your account. It doesn't matter even how many accounts you have. We are needing to trust God continually with what we do have. Here's what Jesus says in Luke chapter number 12. He says, don't strive for what you should eat and what you should drink, and don't be anxious. For the Gentile world eagerly seeks all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be provided for you. Don't be afraid, little flock, because your Father delights to give you the kingdom. In fact, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Make money bags for yourselves that won't grow old, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven where no thief comes and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. He goes on to say, actually, to a church in Revelation chapter 3, he reminds this church of Laodicea. He says, for you say, I'm rich. I have become wealthy I need nothing, but you don't realize that you're actually wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Now, let me ask you, if your bank account is padded and you feel good about life, can I ask you this question? If your bank account is going higher, does your trust in God go lower? Usually what we do in life is if when that bank account's low, man, we only can trust God. Like, God, you've got to bring that in. You've got to pay that bill. You've got to bring in the rent check. And our trust is at an all-time high. But if you've noticed in your life, because I've seen it in mine, when that bank account gets a little bit higher, our trust gets a little bit lower. Here's the problem. You and I begin to trust in ourselves. Now, I wonder, I don't speak this over anybody. I'm verbal processing. I'm thinking out loud. I wonder if the reason sometimes we don't have what we want is because God says, if I gave that to you, I don't know that you would trust me. Sometimes we put our trust in so many other things that God's like, all right, let's take this away. Let's take this away. Let's take this away. Let's cut that in half. Okay, we're gonna shave that down a little bit. You're gonna take a haircut on that. Okay, now where are you? And you're like, God, I need you. And God's like, all right, there we go. Now we can get started. But too often we trust in so many other things than God. You see, we need to redefine what our needs are. I'm going to talk about this on Sunday. I believe there's two underrated secrets to biblical stewardship. One is contentment. We are not as content as we should be. I'm going to talk about that this Sunday. The second thing that really keeps us from stewardship is comparison. Oh my goodness, do we compare all the time? And so what I think we need to understand is that you and I, we have a roof over our heads. Now, is it the roof maybe you want? Maybe not. Does your roof leak? Maybe. But we have a roof over our heads. You have food to eat. Are you eating, ribeyes every night? Tomahawk steaks? Probably not. It's not good for you anyway, but probably not. Are you having bacon-wrapped filet? By the way, yes, I'm a meat lover, okay? So that's why all my food are meat. But we have food, we have shelter, we have blessings. But too often, we redefine what we need. And so let me encourage you to trust God continually. I need to wrap up our time with this. We need to, number 4, defend our heart repeatedly. We read this in Matthew chapter number 6, and he mentions in verse 21, he says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." He goes on to say in Luke chapter 3, talks about this idea that we need to just continually defend our heart. Now, I wrote in my notes, but it probably won't make sense to most of us, but my idea was that we would check our checkbook. But I don't think we have checkbooks anymore. But here's what I mean. What I mean is, do you remember back in the day, I'm old enough to remember when we were taught in school how to balance a checkbook. I don't know what they teach today, but I know they don't teach balancing a checkbook because there are no checkbooks. But do you remember what you could do in your checkbook? You can go back and you can say, all right, I paid this for rent, I paid this for my electric, now it's all digitized, but let me encourage you to go back to however you have a systemized method of seeing all your bills and all your payments. But here's what I ask you. Here's what I want you to look at. Look at all those bills or those payments or those things that you purchased and ask yourself, from all of those purchases, what are my priorities? Because here is sometimes what you're going to find. Wow, you love yourself a lot. I got this for me. Wow, I had a lot of me days over the last month. I thought I was just doing one day of retail therapy, but I did a whole month. I had a rough month, I guess. I just need to go shopping for myself. What you're going to find when you go back to your checkbook or your online statements or your bills, statements that you get in the mail, your account statements, you're going to find your own priorities, because Jesus reminds us, for where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. This is why I say all the time when I talk about money, because sometimes people get uncomfortable. In fact, if you missed this past Sunday, we had an incredible message by Ellie Kay, one of our own, and she brought just a powerful message on finance that you need to go back to. In fact, you're going to get an LEK fix this week because this Friday, our next podcast episode drops, and she gives gold on that episode. You've got to download that and take some notes. But we're going through the next few weeks of this idea of financial stewardship, biblical stewardship. What does God's word say about our money? Because many times we go through life without a theological framework for how we're supposed to interact and use and give our money. And so when you go back and you look and you say, whoa, I spent this on that, and I spent this on me, and I spent this on them, you begin to find, wow, like those were my priorities. So here's what I say all the time when we talk about money. The church, this church, is not after your money, but God is after your heart. Because here's what happens. When you go back and look at all your purchases, let me ask you this question. Not did you tie to the church? That's not the question. The question is, does God have your heart? You'll find that there's purchases, and it's the same for me. This is not me speaking to you. This is us looking at God's word. You'll find that our priorities are often out of whack. And so we need to understand that we need to defend our heart repeatedly. We need to say, okay, God, that last month, that was a rough month. Forgive me, I'm so sorry. I didn't put you first, and my treasure showed where my heart was, and so I need to recalibrate. But there's a fifth statement that Jesus makes in Luke chapter 16, and it's very simple, but it's often overlooked, and that is to use money wisely. If we could sum up everything Jesus talked about with finances, it's this phrase, use money wisely. And here's what he says in Luke chapter 16, verse number 10. Whoever is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And whoever is unrighteous in very little is also unrighteous in much. So if you have not been faithful with worldly wealth, who will trust you with what is genuine? And if you've not been faithful with what belongs to someone else, who will give you what is your own? No man can serve two masters. Either he'll hate the one or love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. You see, we can't expect God to give us more when we can't manage a little. And so we need to use our money wisely. Pay our bills on time. We need to take care of our family. We need to make sure our responsibilities are taken care of. We need to be generous, because what we're saying is, God, you're giving me this X amount of money. I'm going to steward it so well that God really has no other choice than to say, I'm going to bless you with more. And we're not giving to get. We understand that. But the idea is that, hey, we want to be good stewards with whatever it is. And so when we're good stewards with this, God says, all right, I'll give you a few more coins. We're good stewards of that. Okay, here's a few more coins. And here's the idea. The idea is not to get more for you. The idea is to have more to give others, because that is advancing God's kingdom. I go back to the greatest biblical example of stewardship in the entire Bible, and I believe it's in the most famous verse in the Bible of John 3:16. Whenever I think about stewardship, I always think of this verse because you perhaps know the verse. It's, for God so loved the world that he gave. You see, Jesus was God's son. And God loved you so much, he loved me so much, that he willingly gave his son. It's a pretty hard ask if you're a parent to say, all right, I'm going to give my son for others, but that's what God the Father did for you and I. You see, God the Father, Jesus, his son, they don't just say, do this, and do as I say, not as I do. They led the way in the ultimate stewardship. And they said, all right, if I'm going to ask you to give, I'm going to give more. If I'm asking you to be faithful in this, then I'm going to be faithful and consistent in this as well. And so I want to encourage you, wherever you are, here's the deal. It doesn't matter what your account looks like. It doesn't matter if you're overdrawn or if you've got several accounts, or if you're wondering how that light bill is going to be paid this week, or everything's on auto pay. It doesn't matter right now. What matters is, what are you stewarding well? What are your priorities? And how do they reflect your heart for God? For God so loved the world that he gave. Now, here's what I want to share with you on Wednesday night. It's hard to understand God's plan for your money if you don't follow God yourself. On our wall, we have these two words, following Jesus. We are passionate here at the Highlands of encouraging people to say yes to God, to follow Jesus, because we believe that doesn't make everything go away, but it makes everything a little bit easier. And so when we follow Jesus, Jesus is saying, I'm going to come alongside you, and listen, tragedy is going to strike. There are going to be bad days and worse days, and there are going to be days where you're like, is this all worth it? But I want to encourage you that when Jesus is by your side, what you'll find is you've got hope. You have hope. You have healing. You have a purpose for what God has called you to do. So what we do every service, whether we're talking about money or whether we're talking about heaven or whether we're talking about anything else in Scripture, is we always make room for those of you who've never said yes. And those watching online, if you've never followed Jesus yourself, if you never said, God, thank you for this gift that you gave me of your Son sacrificed on the cross. I want to accept him. We always take a moment after every service to do that. So would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me as we wrap up our time together? And in just a minute, I'm going to give you an opportunity to say yes to God, to pray. And I won't embarrass you. I won't ask you to stand, come forward, or anything. I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand in a moment. I just want to lead you into a short, simple prayer. If you're watching online, you can join us as well. But before I do, I have one more question, and that's for those of you who have already said yes. Here's the question. Does God have your heart? That's it. That's the question. Now, before you say yes, think back to your purchases, because Jesus reminds us, for where your treasure is, that is where your heart is. I'm not going to ask you to lift your hand or confess or do anything of that sort, but I'm going to ask you to just pray right now and say, God, I want you to have my heart. I want you to have my heart. These next 30 days, I want it to reflect my heart for you. Maybe those last 30 days were rough and we're just going to move on from them, but these next 30 days have promise. These next 30 days have a future. These next 30 days will help you reflect the heart of God more deeply and more closely. If you've never said yes to God and you've never welcomed him into your life and said, God, thank you for this gift, I want to encourage you right now. There is no one looking around. Every head is bowed, every eye is closed. I won't embarrass you. But you are in a safe space. You're in a space with friends who love you and will cheer you on and encourage you. But if that's you and you say, Pastor Jeremy, I've never said yes to God, but I want to pray that prayer. I want to invite him into my life, and I want to give him my heart because he has given me so much. If that's you in this room with no one looking around, every head is bowed, every eye is closed, would you do me the absolute honor of just simply raising your hand and saying, Pastor Jeremy, would you include me in that prayer? I see you. I see you. I agree with you all the way in the back. What a great decision. I see you over here on my left. I'm so encouraged by you. I see you as well. I agree with you. I see you. I see you. What a great decision that you're making. I know it's Wednesday night. It's midweek service, but what a great decision that you're making all the way in the back. And I see you as well. Now, if you're watching online, God is everywhere. He's with you right now, wherever you are. And so would you join these hands that were raised and pray this simple prayer right wherever you are? Dear God, thank you for loving me. Thank you for giving me salvation. Thank you for sending your Son, Jesus, to die on the cross for me. I pray that you would come into my life and clean me from the inside out. Help me to walk in your ways. Thank you for this gift, and help me to follow you all the days of my life. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.